My name is Abigail, and today I'm going to be talking about protecting satellites, learning from the past to secure the future. And I'm going to ask a question. How many of you think that these satellites are important for our critical infrastructure? I love to see a lot of hands. So you're all right here. And um, before I start, I'm a cyber system engineer, and I am also a PhD candidate, and this is part of my investigation as well. And this is basically the first phase of my investigation of my dissertation. So I'm going to talk about the introduction, the rise of, call it this way, the rise of these satellites, and then the cyber attacks throughout the different decades since the first launch of these satellites. And I'm going to start with a historical data of the satellites. And basically, the satellites were invented by Arthur Clarke. Well, the idea of the satellites. So in 1945, in the wireless world, he started giving the idea that of the geostationary um, satellites. And he said, well, this is possible if we have three satellites on space. And that actually intrigued a lot of engineers and scientists. And they were like, wow, we can make this happen. So let's just try this out. And Russia and the US, or the Soviet Union, how we call it in the past, started inventing and creating different kind of designs to make this a possibility. And after that, um, basically, it all started on October 4, 1957, that we had the first satellite on space. And over here, we can see this will answer your question about the critical infrastructure. This is from CISA. And we can see on the left that there are communication. CISA identifies 16 sectors that are really important in general for the nation security and to sustain a nation in general. So it will be communication, um, cell phone, it could be internet, etc. Energy. Our power grids also depend from uh, are part of the critical infrastructure and depend on satellites. Government operation, national security. We also have transportation, GPS. We use GPS for everything. We have defense. We have finance. Anything that had to be Bitcoin, banks, etc. We have the healthcare. I name it that way, but this will be all our medical record is online, and they use a different kind of structure to find your medical record information. Emergency services, ambulance, police, and food. This will be our agriculture. I forgot that word in English. I'm sorry, but basically to verify how our food is growing on the land, the IT and the water management. And then on the right side, you will see four different kind of sectors. This will be the chemical, this will be the dam. This will be the critical manufacturing, the nuclear sector, and the commercial facility. I meant to say five. We can see here that the ones on the left, these are 11. They are directly supported by the satellites. And the ones on the right are indirectly supported by the satellites. So basically, all of our sectors are supported somehow by the satellites. And I really wanted to mention this before going into the cyber attacks that we are going to identify by decade. After the first launch, which was in 1957, these satellites were used for different reasons. For example, space exploration, scientific research. That was the first kind of satellites that we had on space, reconnaissance, and then early weather observation. On 1960s, here we started giving a little bit more broad to the humanity with communication, weather monitoring, and reconnaissance as well. This was an evolution of it. And in the 1970s, we started with the navigation, Earth observation, and communication. In this year, basically the military were using the GPS, but also the people were starting spreading the GPS. And this is when we see that the kind of cyber attacks started. So this is where I'm starting in my 1980s. I want to clarify that all of the cyber attacks that I mentioned here are unclassified and they're public, basically on the news or were described on different papers. So they're not classified type of attacks. So they might be more cyber attacks that were not mentioned here. But for the ones that were public, we can see that they were a lot. So I'm going to go through them a little by little here. And I'm going to start, let me see. This is really there we go. So we're gonna start with the first one, and the first one were scientists, well, Polish scientists that wanted to verify if there were a way to corrupt or get to the satellites, and they decided, oh yes, we actually can get into the satellite and corrupt it, and that was an experiment, scientific experiment, but that actually opened the idea of wow, we can actually get into corrupting satellites. And the second attack that we see here, the Captain Midnight, it was a really known attack. It was basically when the HBO was really expensive. It was 12.95 in 1985. I think that's a lot of money. And he decided to protest and send a message and say, "Well, good evening, HBO from Captain Midnight, 12.95. No way." And this basically, since it was global, because all the people that had HBO saw this message, they were like, "Wow, we can start getting into corrupting satellites and verifying how we can get into the signal and protest with it, etc." The third one is an Earth observation satellite. This was identified as an eavesdropping, and basically, some images from the world were spread globally. And basically the government was really concerned that this could lead us to a different or a war or either um, classified information that is not supposed to be out there as well. And the last attack from the 1980s was the Playboy channel. They corrupted the signal and they basically sent a message, a religious message from the Bible, um, just to let them know, like, what you're doing is not okay, basically. We can see here, even though this is the first decade that we reported cyber attacks on satellite, we still had four of them. And here I have a small chart which mentioned that we had more hijacking and one eavesdropping. Basically, three hijacking in the 1980s and one eavesdropping. And this is the 1990s. And in the 1990s, all these cyber attacks started to go up. As you saw previously, we had four in the 1980s. Here we have nine. And I'm going to start talking a little bit about the first five. So the first one was in 1993. And this was the first event that had anything to do with cryptography. So that basically employed a vulnerability of how the encryption of the satellites, if they were good, if they were wrong, if so they were like, wow, this is kind of weak. If they could actually corrupt our encryption, because yes, in 1990s we did had encryption in our satellites as well. If you ask that question, our technology is currently the same, a little bit more adapted into what we have in the 1980s, but we change how we encrypt it or how we do things in the satellite nowadays. Then after that, the satellites were used more into war. For example, if a government didn't want it to have a message of uh, how are you going to vote in these next elections, they will protest. They will jam the signal, and they will send a different kind of signal. We also have a videography from Gregory Manser, is it the person that um, removed HBO after the attack that we had on the previous decade. They put an encryption to their signal, and that signal was also corrupted to protest for a different kind of um, TV program that we had over there. And then move on to the last four of the 1990s. And here we can see that one of the most important, well, I will call it this way, one of the most important cyber attacks was the ROSAT. ROSAT is really known attack, and it was because we had a payload permanent, permanent failure. um, they got into the satellite and they moved the solar panels into directly into the X-ray of the sun, and basically it got corrupted and we couldn't use this satellite. So this is the first satellite in history that got down because of cyber attack. We also had the first unauthorized command or access to Skynet in this decade. So in this decade, we can see that we have more sophisticated cyber attacks, and we also have different kind of cyber attacks. In the previous year, it was hijacking and eavesdropping that predominated, but in this year, we can see a little bit more diverse cyber attacks. We have only one hijacking, and that was the type of cyber attack that predominated the previous decade. And here we have more jamming by four, and we have two, followed by two, cryptography. And then we have the payload failure that I put a triangle there because it was the only, for now, the only cyber attack identified that we had a total failure of the system. For the 2000, as you can guess, since we have more satellites on space, we have more cyber attacks throughout the decade. So I'm going to go through this first five. And here we have Falun Gong was a really famous hacker. And in this decade, Falun Gong had three cyber attacks identified in this slide and on the next slide. But we also have GPS, which is the first time that we see a record of GPS spoofing or jamming. So in this case, we had a jamming on the GPS for military tank. In this case, U.S. and British tank lost their communication. So this is really critical when we are working with this kind of systems. If we lose communication during war, if we lose communication during a political conflict, or if we lose any kind of communication in general, how can this affect us? Also, the last one, it was the only incident that came from Cuba, and basically, this was a Voice of America. They were going to send a political message, and they just basically removed the information. They were like, no, we're not allowing this information to go through. Then we have this other five. So we can see the cyber attacks are incrementing here. And as I mentioned previously, we have the other two attacks from Falun Gong. He was a really famous hacker that it was, well, it got a lot of attacks in the 2000s. And if you can see something curious in this slide, we have three hijacking and two jammings. So Falun Gong was really famous for hijacking their satellite, and mostly the Asian sat was the one that he used, especially the transponder, to send a protest message as well. We also had different kind of cyber attacks that were for telephone, were for internet, were for messages, etc. And we also had encryption messages that were corrupted here. So we can see that we had one that was spy satellite, because depending on the function of the satellite, the payload is different. So the kind of attack could be different depending on the hacker. So in this case, we had a sensor disruption for the spy satellite, and a lot of information that was classified was taken by these hackers as well. We also had unauthorized data that was not supposed to be taken. They actually accessed this. Kind of Earth satellite, because these were Earth satellite, three times. One was 12 minutes, the other one was 8 minutes, and the other one was 10 minutes. So maybe if you think about 8 minutes is nothing, when you are in orbit, 8 minutes is a lot. You can actually remove the satellite from orbit. You can actually corrupt the system. You can do a lot in 8 minutes. So this was really critical because it took till 12 minutes in the system. They having information and hacking the system in general. These are the last two cyber attacks for the 2000. And here we can see that they also got into the satellite station. And this is a station that is more up in the UK, but because of political issues, they got into the system and they got into a different system. And here we got a connection in this kind of decade because they connected from one system to a different system and they got into the station. I didn't add a lot of information because I didn't want it to include the different kind of I was call it countries that intercepted this kind of satellite system or satellite station and how it got. But basically, we can see here that it got like like a network connection in there. Here we can see that this is a bigger kind of cyber attacks that we had in this kind of system, and jamming predominated this decade. We can see a lot of cyber attacks for um, jamming, followed by hijacking. But we also got the sensor disruption for the first time in this decade. We also have unauthorized access for the first time, two times. And we also had eavesdropping in this decade. And then for the 2010, there we go. So here, if you went into the different satellites that were previously mentioned on the decade 2000, um, we know that the satellites are on space 5, 10, 15, 20 years, depending on what their function is. So here we can see that we had Eutelsat was repeated as a jamming again. Because once they found the vulnerability of this system, they were like, well, we can keep protesting and we can keep using this system because basically protecting the satellite on space on orbit is really complicated, and that is something that we continue to study today. Because if we do an update of a software while it's on on orbit, we can lose the system in general. So we have like fragment of few seconds, few minutes to basically work on this system before doing anything. And what they prefer to do is, let's not touch the satellite, let it be. And if it's corrupted, unless it's not a payload failure or something else, until we find a solution that we can actually, make this work while it's on orbit, we are going to continue doing studies or continue leave it over there, and it's going to continue having a lot of attacks. So here we see Eutelsat and Algeciras, I will call it that way. So here, besides political, they also corrupted a FIBA game. They were like, well, this is not something that go with us, so I'm just gonna corrupt this. And they jammed the signal and they couldn't watch the final of the game. We also had GPS jamming, and we had radio and phone jam as well. Here we have the Arabsat and Eutelsat. So here, basically, they use one of the satellites to jam the signal of another satellite. And this is something that was introduced for the first time in the 2010. And basically, they were like, what if I get into this satellite, which it was the Eutelsat, that they already knew how to jam and how to get into the system? How come if we can use this one to get to another one? So they got into the Eutelsat and they corrupted the Arabsat as well. And here they got into the weather satellite. And one of the reason why this is really critical is because if we have hurricanes, tornadoes, or anything else that we're monitoring from that satellite, basically the humanity can be affected by it. We also had different kinds of network intrusion. So here we can see that the numbers are increasing. I put some numbers in the circles below because basically we have more jammings by the same year. So we have a lot of jamming this year. We also had hijacking, and we have GPS spoofing. These were the three top type of cyber attacks that we had throughout this decade. And then for the 2020s, which is uh, our current decade, I wanted to just showcase here how many satellites we had. And from 2020 to 2025, we had an increase of 75% of satellites on orbit. And the reason why is because SpaceX is has a lot of Starlinks on orbit, and they continuously send a lot of satellites to orbit. So this data is from March 2025, and you can see that in one decade is increasing 82% from 2020 to 2021, then 38%, and from 2024 until 2025, only March, it was 18%, but currently is more than 1200 and 12,500 satellites, and is only like 2 months away from this data. And this increase also affected how many cyber attacks, and we might think, well, it's only 2025. But here we have a really famous cyber attack, which is the VSAT. And this one was the first supply chain. And when I say supply chain, it took over everything. It took over communication. It took over banks. It took over the government agency. It took over everything. And the reason why, it was because of war. So basically, they found a way to corrupt another country or cut communication to the other country to get into their space and get a little bit more into, I will say, get a little bit more victory into the war, get a little bit more farther into their country as well, without they noticing. So in here, we can see that the 1+1 media, it was also a media from Ukraine. So most of these cyber attacks were basically included or were based on the Ukraine Russia war. So this was more into political aspect more than into a different way of protest or anything else. So they started removing communication, then they started removing media, they then started removing any communication on banks, etc., etc. We also have a GPS spoofing, and this GPS spoofing was for the different navigation ships that were stationed close to Russia. And basically, they were navigating close by. They lost all the communication. They started going in circles on the same spot because they didn't want to hit anything, or a chip. So they started going in circles until the GPS signal came back. And here, we see that it looks like a little bit just of cyber attacks, but because we're only in 2025 and now we are more into classified kinds of cyber attacks, because not all of them are public or published. So basically, here we can see that we have more jamming, and we also had GPS spoofing, we have backdoor, we had supply chain for the first time, we had GPS jamming. And as we can see, jamming after the 1990s was the one that predominated um, in the cyber attacks. So here is like an analysis of what kind of cyber attacks are more common to this system. And as I mentioned, the payloads are different for the cyber attacks. What we can see, which will make a difference in the cyber attacks, is what I meant to say. But we can see that jamming is the one that predominated for more than 50% of the attacks from 1980s till today, then followed by hijacking, and then we had GPS spoofing was the third one. We had cryptography, the fourth one. Eavesdropping and espionage were the following one. But we had a variety of interception, network intrusion, sensor disruption, and other kinds of cyber attacks. And the intent of this presentation is more not to point into what are the vulnerabilities of the system, but more into what we could do. And we can see that there are cyber attacks that are predominating since 1980s. So what we could do to protect these systems that are so important for us. They help us in many ways: communication, they help us in transportation, they help us in security, national security, they help us in defense in many, many ways. So, the intent of this investigation is more into what we could do based on these cyber attacks. And basically, that will be my conclusion for the presentation today. Thank you.